I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm Jesse Lawler, your host, here with the 28th episode of this podcast, dedicated to the improvement of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal, including pharmaceuticals and supplements and crazy sci-fi gadgetry that we would have thought was total lunacy a couple of years ago and now is making its way into the marketplace and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to be talking this week with Commander Mark Devine, a former Navy SEAL and a guy who's actually still really way up in the mix of special ops and stuff like that because he's training people that are currently trying to get into the special ops programs and also training people that are looking to toughen themselves up both physically and mentally for career stuff, personal betterment stuff. Anyway, really interesting conversation coming up about mental toughness and what that means, kind of chewing around the edges of the idea that it kind of doesn't really matter how book smart or sort of purely intelligent you might be if that all sort of falls away and you lose track of your ability to think clearly the moment that stress enters your life. Anyway, if you hang around until the end of the episode, I'm going to drop a book recommendation on you this is actually a brain book that I haven't read yet, but it sounds really interesting and I wanted to let you know that it's out there. I also just finished a brain book that I actually did read from Dan Hurley. Dan Hurley is a science author who's going to be the interview guest on our next podcast episode, but at this point, that's next week, and I'm getting way ahead of myself. So first, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
So ultrasound, something that's been around for a long time, something that is basically using really, really high-frequency sound waves to get images of things, kind of like sonar within the human body. When we think ultrasound, we always think pregnant women and taking a look inside the womb at babies before they're born. But ultrasound can be used for all kinds of stuff. And it turns out that ultrasound might be very useful for brain augmentation, the same way that transcranial magnetic stimulation and transcranial direct current stimulation have been used to show improvements in brain performance based on stimulation of certain regions. So ultrasound can actually be used in the same way. Study researcher William Tyler, who's a neuroscientist at the Virginia Tech Carilion Research Institute, said we can use ultrasound to target an area of the brain as small as the size of an M&M. So one of the things that they did in this study was they took an area, they targeted an area with ultrasound that has to do with tactile sensation in the hand, and they stimulated it. And then they ran a test on tactile sensitivity. They put two little pins next to somebody's skin that they couldn't see their hand, and you bring those pins closer together, and eventually those two pinpricks start feeling like one pinprick, and that sort of threshold of where two feels like one is, it's one measure of tactile sensitivity. Anyway, tactile sensitivity notably improved when they were stimulating this hand-specific region of the brain with ultrasound. Now, what's interesting is how counterintuitive it was the way it actually worked. The electrical activity of that brain region that was stimulated was actually calmed down by the ultrasound. So it looked like it was a less active region based on the electrical activity of the brain while being stimulated, but the actual discernment capabilities of the people improved. So that sort of flew in the face of what their expectations would be. Normally you think, an active region of the brain, this is going to be an area that's working harder and therefore better at whatever it's doing. Ultrasound allowed a brain region to be apparently less active, at least electrically speaking, but still doing its job better than it normally would. So very interesting finding.
Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so as I mentioned, our main interview today is with Mark Devine. He is an ex-Navy SEAL, and he is the owner of SEALFIT. He's the author of a couple of different books, including The Way of the SEAL and Unbeatable Mind, Forging Mental Toughness. I guess you would almost consider his role sort of that of a self-help guru these days, except looking a little bit more like G.I. Joe and less like Oprah. He has a facility called Kokoro Camp down in the San Diego region where he does physical real-world training on people and also has a lot of online presence as well. So he'll be talking about all that stuff today. We talked for a long time, probably cut the interview down to a manageable length here. But Mark really had a wealth of knowledge in a lot of different regions, and is the kind of guy that I'd love to get back on for a sort of a follow-up episode in the future because he had a lot to say.
Smart Drug Smarts.
Every year, a couple thousand young men, when I say young, anywhere from, at the very earliest with parental permission, 17-year-old, up to 31, 32 with an age waiver, even though the actual cutoff from the SEALs is 28. So in that age group, predominantly you're going to be 19, 20, 21 range, right? Yeah. Or a little bit older. And so a couple thousand guys, aspirational guys say, I want to do this. And so of those couple thousand, they go through the process and end up literally with about 850 or 900 people who make it to the actual front door of BUDS, which is Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training down in Coronado, California. So the rest of them get washed out in that process, from raising their hand, going to see a recruiter, boot camp. The follow-on training after boot camp is called BUDS preparation, and so well over half get washed out before they even step foot in the SEAL training. Mm-hmm. So then in the SEAL training, of the 5 classes they have a year, each class classes up with anywhere from 150 to 200 students. Out of each class, they'll lose 80%.
Wow.
And so anecdotally, my class is a good example because I know the exact numbers. We had 180 people start and 19 of us graduated.
Yeah.
And so, like, if you do the math, 19 out of the original 2,000 is a pretty low
Yeah, it's around 1%, yeah.
So everybody who showed up at BUDS had the physical attributes to be a Navy SEAL, meaning they had met all the minimum requirements. They had passed through all those other wickets. And so physically, they should have been able to handle it, right? Now, there were some injuries. The injuries predominantly come from durability issues, meaning, they just, their frame wasn't up for the constant pounding, right?
Yeah.
You may be a spot athlete where you can, just bang out an amazing screening test score because you're a talented athlete. But if you get the shit beat out of you every day for 6 months straight, eventually someone's going to break. Those athletes are going to break. And, the people who end up enduring that might be the guy who was slinging bales of hay on the farm for years. You know what I mean?
Right.
They're just so much more durable. And so becoming a SEAL is less to do with athletic prowess. Having said that, you need the foundational athleticism and fitness level just to even apply for the job.
Sure, that'll get you in the door, but it's not going to keep you there.
Get you in the door. But then the mental game has many aspects to it. Part of it is the daily discipline, right? To manage your mental states. And that's one that I really try to dig into and really help train people, especially with The Way of the SEAL, the book that I just had come out. How do you cultivate that win in your mind every day? How do you show up so you can put out 100% and be there for your teammates with a smile on your face? And, you really don't get disrupted by the tumult of what's going around you. You stay stay calm and focused and clear-headed, through all of that. Now that's mental management, and there's a lot to that on how you do that. And then there's the discipline to go the distance, right? And that is like mental fortitude, that grit, to really go the distance. And 6 months, 9 months, year after year in the most grueling environments of the world, it takes a lot of grit and a lot of fortitude. And so that's something that is trainable as well. And learning how to be a good teammate is not necessarily natural for everybody either. And you go into these teams and you have to be utterly trustworthy and open communication, and you literally have to develop a pleasing personality in order to be an excellent teammate. And so that's a skill that is also part mental and part emotional.
Yeah,
right?
That's interesting. That's one I hadn't even thought to talk about. But yeah, how to play well with others in groups is like, we don't really think of that typically as intelligence per se, but social intelligence is so important.
It's very important, right? And social intelligence really has to do with emotional awareness, I think, a lot of it. And it's hard to connect with other humans when you can't connect with yourself. And emotional intelligence really, to me, is just the other side. It's the body's way of communicating. And so, your body is the feeler and your mind is the thinker, or your brain is the thinker. And the two of them work hand in hand. They're like twins. You got to develop them both, cultivate the mental awareness for that mental control, and then cultivate that body and emotional awareness for the body and emotional control. And when you bring those together, mental and emotional control, that's where you get true resiliency.
So let's talk about some of that training process, because you said that pretty much everything you just rattled off there are trainable skills, but probably I imagine some of that training is not going to be what people consider comfortable. Just weight training is not necessarily comfortable in the process of doing it, even though the results are good.
Right.
Tell us about what goes into the sort of the mental training to get some of these sort of what are ultimately positive virtues.
With my model, we clearly like to leverage physical training. I mean, SEALFIT and Unbeatable Mind, my physical training, it's designed to teach people to basically get fit and to have the mental toughness on the par with a Navy SEAL over time. Is it absolutely required for everybody to do the physical training? No, but you'd be hard pressed to say that you shouldn't have some sort of functional training regimen that allows your body to be a solid foundation for health and happiness and being able to be useful in the world. And we all know how much more confident you are if you can move well and functionally, and you can run and swim and jump and play and climb and throw things, right? It just really has a big impact on your psychological state. So physical training is certainly an aspect of it, but I think you're most interested in what mental training tools do we use. So the physical training we use to bridge people to mental training, but the mental training then we pick up from there. And I'm not a super technologist, right? So I don't use like biofeedback and those things, even though I think they're valuable. I like to leverage, Mark I motto warrior tools that have been around for centuries, but to contextualize them for the modern warrior or the modern, corporate athlete. I use things like guided visualization. I've got a couple exercises I developed that are guided visualization exercises for different purposes. And the primary one is to cultivate a deep stillness, or to calm that mind, right? That outer rational Western mind that, we so identify with. My philosophy is, or view of the world, is that's just a small aspect of our whole mind. I've kind of alluded to a little bit in this conversation. And that yet it's been trained, overtrained, let's say, with the way we educate ourselves here in the West and the way we kind of think. And so what we want to do is redevelop that aspect of our mind to use it more optimally when we need it, and then to get it out of the way when we want to tap into the deeper sense of our mind, which includes our subconscious and seat of intuition, and to connect with our heart mind and our belly mind. And so the still water runs deep visualization is one of the several methods I have for developing that deep stillness of the mind, greater presence, and cultivating a connection with what I call your witness, which is kind of your mind behind the mind, right? The person that that aspect of you that is ever present, ever watching, and the one who's going to know the right decision, regardless of what's going on.
I'm just going to interrupt real quick to ask
Sure.
if you've read a book called The Third Man Factor. This came out maybe 3 or 4 years ago. This was an interesting book. It reminds me a lot of what you're talking about now. It's a book about survival situations where people are really on the brink of total physical collapse, but are trying to pull themselves through something. And kind of the and this is sort of a pan-cultural thing. People from all across the world, all different time periods have described it, where you kind of feel like your brain almost splits into two, and there's sort of the authoritative captain, which is kind of, I think what you're talking about is this deeper brain, belly brain sort of thing, which it essentially gives instructions to what one would normally think of as their ego. And you kind of, your brain goes into like both like a parent and a child state duality.
Interesting. Yeah. That's very much similar to what I'm talking about. And we see this all the time in our Kokoro camp, which is one of the training programs that we offer at SEALFIT, is a 50-hour nonstop crucible experience. It's loosely modeled after Hell Week. And it's 50 hours of nonstop training and no sleep.
Oh, God.
And it's arduous physical training. I mean, you're running and, rucking with heavy weight up 20 miles up a mountain and down, and performing lots of various tasks and doing CrossFit workouts. And I mean, it is super arduous. And people find, our saying is that people will meet themselves for the first time some point during the training. And when what that means is exactly what you just said. They're going to, their outer rational mind, their ego associated mind, their identity mind is going to shut off, because it's going to be super fatigued. It's going to be sleep deprived. It's going to be confused, and it's not going to have its normal crutches, right? PDAs and phones and TV and all this stuff. It's just, everything is completely foreign to it, and there's going to be a point where it says, I can't go on anymore. And yet, assuming the trainee's purpose for being there, their why is strong enough, they know they can't quit. Some aspect of them, a deeper part of them, basically rises up and takes control and says, no, we're not quitting. We are going to get through this. You are going to get through this. I am going to get through this. And they say, oh, that is me. Right. That is, that's who I really am. And then they find great strength, both in a, spiritual sense, and also in a physical sense, and also in a emotional, social sense, because that strength, they immediately recognize that other people are in the same boat, and they start to take their eyes off themselves and put it on their teammates. And, the energy starts flowing again. And all of a sudden they're hooting and hollering, and, and it's just remarkable to see that transformation, that occurs when people step out of that limited thinking mind into their greater sense of, witnessing self.
Interesting.
And so, that's a tool. It sounds quasi spiritual because, again, we are these kind of mental, emotional, and spiritual beings. And our kind of a belief, and it may sound funny for a SEAL to say this, but our belief, and this is very borne out through my SEAL training, many, situations where, grueling situations where I was on the verge of literally wondering if I would not just be able to continue, but survive.
Yeah.
And had similar experiences like this. And so, in a way, the warrior arts and the warrior careers have a very spiritual component to them. You know what I mean? And we look at it as an intelligence. I mean, not necessarily, tied to any kind of faith, even though that's obviously very much part of it for many people. And we teach people to say, hey, continue your faith, but let's look at spirituality in a broader sense. Let's look at it as an intelligence. And how we can connect with our soul and our spirit and use that connection to really deepen our awareness and our understanding and our connection. And that's where like the source of real physical strength will come from. The type of physical strength that allows the mom to pull the car off, her trapped child, that's coming from a different place, you know what I mean?
Sure.
It's not just physical.
Well, yeah, and I think for somebody that does have sort of a religious background or spiritual with a capital S, and then goes through an experience like that, that's certainly an easy way to frame up what that experience was, what was actually going on there when their brain sort of did feel that duality.
Right, and we don't really have other language to kind of describe it just yet. I mean,
exactly.
Some of the technology advancements that we've talked about at the beginning of the call, that we'll find new language around what's going on there. So yeah, back to the training. That's kind of one of our first steps, is to really, I call the whole process learning to win in your mind before you step foot into the battle. And so getting control of the mind and being able to connect with deeper levels of your thinking self, your mind, is really the first step. So we use this guided visualization, and then we use breathing, right? Box breathing is the practice that I developed. Very, very simple, breath control method that has a great effect on reducing your stress and allowing you to control your mind and keep it focused, concentrated on one thing for long periods of time. Mm-hmm. And so now we've kind of introduced two really key concepts: visualization and breathing, box breathing or controlled breathing, deep diaphragmatic breathing. And then the third primary tool that we use is, what I call the skill of positivity. And that is really like taking a look at the inner dialogue and the belief systems that drive you, and then to route out weak or negative or unproductive, belief systems and thought patterns and inner dialogues, and replace it with very, very positive and powerful, future-oriented, optimistic, or whatever terminology you want to use. Yeah. But just upgrade. Basically, what I'm suggesting, to use a computer metaphor, is, we're rebooting the computer and then downloading new software, and it's in the form of much more effective and productive thinking patterns.
Yeah, and I mean, that sounds like almost not traditional psychology, but like a very psychological aspect to what you're doing. So like, one of these programs people go through, you mentioned that you do the 50-hour course, but I would imagine to do sort of a deep dive into identifying the negative thought patterns that people have, that's something much longer.
It takes a lot longer than that.
Yeah,
the 50-hour course, let's just say one end of the spectrum is the physical crucible, where we introduce these principles. I call them the big four of mental toughness. So the fourth one is just micro goal setting. It's like that's a way to maintain a real presence and forward momentum approach to accomplishing a task or a mission or survival. It's like, break it down to like, what can I accomplish this moment?
Right.
Or in the next 5 minutes or the next hour, depending upon the time frame. Don't think long term. Be aware of the long term, but then chunk it down to the very micro steps, so you can have those micro victories and fail forward fast. So those are the big four: visualization, positivity, breath control, and micro goals. I teach, we introduce those in the physical crucible of Kokoro Camp, and then we cue them all weekend long. Pay attention to your breath. And, for positivity, we ask them, are you feeding the courage dog? Are you feeding the fear dog? Mm-hmm. And so we have these cues that my coaches cue throughout the weekend on the big four. I have two other programs where we go do a deep dive on these skills and a lot of others. One is the Unbeatable Mind program. That's kind of the virtual version of the training that, a lot of executives and other people do on, it's delivered in an online format, and it's 12 lessons, and we're creating a shorter course, but, that's where basically all the content that you see in the way of the SEAL I developed and fleshed out over the last few years. That's called Unbeatable Mind. And then people who want more of an in-person training experience come to what we call an academy. And so we have a 1-week and a 3-week academy. It's a live-in academy here at our training center in Encinitas, California.
Yeah.
Train from, 6 in the morning or 5 in the morning until 7 or 8 at night. It's very intense, but it's immersive, mental, physical, emotional.
One of the things that I'm hearing from you is pretty much that nothing is off the table as far as, as techniques that you might use. It's like to be sort of a world-class performer, it's like you can't say no to any part of the Swiss Army knife that, different cultures have offered.
No, and kind of the SEAL way is to trial and error, and to trial and error on yourself first. And so like everything that I teach, I've done.
Yeah.
I call it eating my own dog food, and I'll eat my own dog food, and if it works, great. If it doesn't, shit can it. And then I try it on my, my hardcore trainees who are the spec ops candidates, and then I'll roll it out to the corporate executive with the caveats that, hey, you got to start at the beginning. Like even a Navy SEAL started with a single push-up, so everyone can develop high level of functional fitness and optimal health if you just follow some real basic principles, right? Quality of the water you drink, quality of the food you eat, the quality of the thoughts you think, how you move your body and moving your body every day. I mean, those are just foundational, fundamental things that if you just do them well, radically transform the quality of your life.
One thing I wanted to ask about was, obviously this show is about people that are interested in improving their own intelligence. And one of the things that I think is probably really a part of that doesn't get thought about much is the difference between intelligence when you're in a nice, comfortable situation, have some time to sit back and think, and intelligence in a high stress situation, which is the kind of thing that you as a SEAL, you would have been dealing with constantly. And I guess, most problems, whether they're physical problems or otherwise, do put people in sort of a heightened stressed state. Tell me, just kind of riff on that for a second.
Well, I think there's a difference between cleverness and wisdom. Just because you're, let's say, have a high IQ is not necessarily an indicator of survivability in a crisis, right? So we want, the high IQ is nice. More intelligent people in developing that cognitive intelligence will certainly help us muscle brain our way through complex problems. But the wisdom is developed by opening up to the greater intelligence that lies within your heart and your belly, right? And so that's your intuition and your heart. One of the reasons I use the word kokoro, for our 50-hour camp is that kokoro is a Japanese word, and it means to merge your heart and your mind into your actions or in your actions. We don't really have a good English word that it is that equivalent.
Yeah.
And so in order to tap into that, you've got to surrender your thinking mind. You got to surrender to having to have all the answers. And sometimes that surrender means to just keep your mouth shut and really, really listen very closely, both to what's going on inside your body and what's going on outside or externally. And that deepens your awareness, right? And that leads to greater wisdom. And so that's one aspect of the puzzle. The other, I would say, is that our minds are, I'm sure you probably read Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast and Slow.
Actually, I've read the synopsis of it. I haven't read the book itself yet.
Oh, it's kind of a behemoth to get through, but the synopsis is certainly enough. Essentially, his basic premise was that our minds play ridiculous tricks on us. And so you really can't trust your thinking mind. There's so many different ways that your mind will trick you, and you'll think you're making the right decision, and you just don't. And this is borne out again and again in all of our lives. And so in the SEALs, what we learn to do is kind of shortcut some of those problems by using mental models, right? And the mental model is essentially like a real simple way to analyze something so that you don't trick yourself into thinking the answer is one way when it could easily be another. And you also don't get stuck in the group version of, that, which is like groupthink or analysis paralysis or some of those things that just slow down and stop, a good decision. And if you're not moving and making decisions in a crisis, then you're dead.
Yeah.
Right? You will literally perish oftentimes. I'm just saying that kind of metaphorically speaking, but it's also been borne out by those who've studied fear and survival. And you got to make a decision and then start moving, and with your team, or if you're alone, and that's how you're going to learn. That's when you start the feedback. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you get that information, and then you start moving again. So that whole process we call the OODA loop, which is to observe, orient yourself to what you observe, make a decision, act on it, observe, the effect of your action, reorient yourself, make another decision, act on it. And
What
and
was the
I just-
acronym there?
The OODA loop.
Okay.
OODA.
That sounds great. Very Dr. Seuss.
I know, really. It's cool. It's so, it's one of those super simple like tools, these mental models. And the OODA loop is one of my favorite.
Yeah.
Because, when you get into those tight situations, you're like, okay, it's both a reminder and a quick model for you to really say, okay, how am I going to get through this? You're not going to solve it by sitting down and writing a 10-page plan, if the world's falling apart around you. You got to make a decision with the best information you have, and then start moving in that direction with a real simple plan. And then you acknowledge that no plan survives contact with the enemy for very long, and that's where the OODA loop comes in. As soon as you hit contact, you break right, you observe what's going on, orient yourself to the deal, make a decision, best one you have, and act on it, and then tighten up that loop. Try to have this happen on the fly.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing sort of mental tool set.
Yeah.
So unbeatablemind.com is your website that you have devoted to this. You're a published author. You've got several of these programs. Definitely feel free to name drop all over the place.
I would say if you're a business leader and you're looking for an edge and some ideas, then my new book, The Way of the SEAL, is a great start. It just came out at the end of December, and it hit number 5 on Wall Street Journal bestseller list for hardcover business books in the first week, which is pretty cool. And I think a large part because Tribe went out and sapped it up. But it's a great book because it's really for leaders, and it's told kind of from my business/SEAL perspective. Then if you're into physical training or inspired by that, SEALFIT.com, all one word, SEALFIT.com, is my physical training business. This is where I kind of co-located where I work here in Encinitas and near where I live. We have a 20,000 square foot training facility. We have an online training program, and then really inspirational and aspirational training in the form of the academies that I reference in that 50-hour Kokoro camp. And we acknowledge that a small percentage of humanity will step up to that level of training, but we have people from all over the world now who fly out to come train with us, and it's really exciting and fun to do that. And then I developed the Unbeatable Mind program because I had a lot of requests from people saying, hey, I really just don't have the physical capacity to do that. I'm inspired by it, though. What else do you have? Can I take part in the mental training? So that's really what inspired me a couple of years ago to build the Unbeatable Mind. So the website, unbeatablemind.com, is where that is. And I also have a book available on Kindle, soon to be published in hard copy, called Unbeatable Mind. That's self-published. And that really kind of introduces, the whole training regimen and the philosophy of Unbeatable Mind.
Mark, thank you so much. It's been a really, really good conversation, and I think people are going to get a ton of value out of this. And yeah, just really a ton of fun.
Okay. Thanks, Jesse.
So thank you so very much to Mark Devine for that great interview. Really, really just a fun conversation. And I tell you, the thing that struck me, even as I was talking with Mark, is like, we have this sort of preconceived notion of like, wow, Navy SEALs, these trained super killer guys, just like so intimidating. And, I'd watched a couple of the videos on Mark's website and stuff like that. And he's a tough looking guy and kind of doing the Sergeant Slaughter thing a little bit in the videos. And so I was expecting maybe a little bit more of that, like, gruff exterior, but just such a super personable dude. It just kind of reminded me that, like, I guess to be really the best at anything, even if it's the best at being the ultimate killing machine or whatever, you kind of need the full human skill set. And part of that is being able to play nicely with others and just have a nice friendly conversation when that's what the situation calls for. Just really struck me as an amazingly well-rounded guy, and just kind of cool to think that you can be super mentally tough but then also downshift to super laid back and chill. But it's that time of the episode where we transition to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
All right, so the Dutch neuroscientist and professor at the University of Amsterdam, D.F. Swab, has just published a book called We Are Our Brains. It seems like it's come down heavily on the side of nature in the whole nature versus nurture debate on what makes us who we are. He's very strongly opinionated, and maybe aggressively so, that the wiring and morphology and sort of physical structures within our brain really define, more or less everything about our personalities, and that we're kind of wired for life to be who we are, and that after an early period of childhood, there's not really going to be much change personality-wise, intentionally or otherwise, within people. So a very kind of biologically deterministic view view of the world. But that's not what the book is necessarily about. That's just sort of something he circles back to again and again throughout the book. He approaches these issues by following individual stories of people that have abnormalities within their brains and how the slightest bit of something, wrong or deviating from the norm as far as the structures within the brain can have just profound effects on how that person goes through the world. It talks about one woman who a small lump in her hypothalamus makes her burst into frequent fits of uncontrollable, mirthless laughter. It talks about people with Capgras syndrome, where people believe that their loved ones have been replaced by alien or robot imposters. Anyway, it goes into a lot of very interesting mental disorders or personality disorders that can be traced back to very physical causes within the brain. We Are Our Brains is the title of the book, and Smart Drug Smarts is the name of this podcast, and that is the full episode this time. Thank you for hanging around till the very end. The show notes for this episode will be online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything that we talked about here. I will be back at you approximately the same time next week, the same podcast, and the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.